When a plane in normal flight is flown below a safe altitude and slams into the ground, it is a deadly type of accident known as controlled flight into terrain. Automation and training have cut fatalities in half since 2010, but technology hasn't eliminated the problem.
Pilots have to maintain their manual handling skills, but they also have to maintain the ability to properly manage and use automation.
Before advances in technology, flying in dark skies and bad weather was even more complicated. November 28, 1979. Air New Zealand Flight 901 has just taken off from Auckland Airport. The DC-10 gracefully spreads its giant wings out over the South Pacific. For the third year in a row, Air New Zealand is offering popular sightseeing flights to one of the most remote and fascinating places on the planet, Antarctica.
Air New Zealand promoted it to be a special event, to go see the bottom of the world. They were selling an experience.
But just minutes from their final destination, a terrifying explosion shatters the silence. It's so loud, it seems one of Antarctica's largest volcanoes is coming to life. It's summer in New Zealand, and Captain Jim Collins is very proud to have drawn one very plum assignment.
It was a privilege to get those flights, and he was thrilled to be getting the last one, which was the 28th of November.
This is Captain Collins and First Officer Greg Cassin's first flight to Antarctica. So, 19 days before takeoff, they're briefed on coordinates that take passengers out over scenic McMurdo Sound.
They were careful to devise a complex but easily flown route that gave the passengers the maximum view.
New Plymouth house builder Frank Christmas, seen here on board the festive sold-out flight, is one of 237 passengers. He's been looking forward to it for a year.
There was lobster and there was champagne and caviar, and so they would have all had a wonderful time. And he was just wanting to see what Antarctica was like.
On a typical flight, passengers get a once-in-a-lifetime view of natural wonders like stunning 12,450-foot Mount Erebus, an active volcano named after Greek mythology's gateway to the underworld. Their personal tour guide,
the aircraft is lowering its altitude now.
None other than legendary Antarctic explorer Peter Mulgrew, seen here on an earlier flight.
Well, everybody up here in the flight deck is saying this is just like a great new world, and I'm sure it is for all of you back there.
Because Air New Zealand's DC-10s never actually touched down in Antarctica during the 8-hour flight, pressure is on the pilots to only descend as low as safely possible.
He was trying to show his passengers something for what they'd paid for. After all, this was a visual sightseeing flight.
There is an expectation that when you get on that airplane, I expect that we're going to fly down there, I'm going to get to see the penguins, and I'm going to get to see the terrain, and I'm going to really get to be a tourist and sightsee.
But Antarctica is as dangerous as it is beautiful. Deputy Police Officer Ted Robinson is stationed at Scott Base at the foot of Mount Erebus.
I had to keep a radio log of all the field parties that were out and what they were doing, just for safety's sakes.
40 minutes from their frozen destination, passengers on Flight 901 are standing at the windows, eager for their first glimpse of the endless expanse of ice. Captain Collins radios Robinson to find out about local weather conditions on Ross Island and learns there's a huge problem.
That particular day, the mountain was completely whited out.
Robinson cautions Captain Collins about low cloud cover that descends to 2,000 feet.
I was very keen to let him know that he shouldn't come anywhere near Ross Island.
Robinson recommends making a short detour west over the mainland where the weather is much better. That's where mountaineer Keith Woodford is stationed for the day.
I was actually over in the Dry Valleys, about 150 kilometres away. We're in brilliantly fine weather.
But Captain Collins ignores Robinson's advice, and just after noon, he begins his descent. McMurdo Air Traffic Control confirms a low overcast and reports of light snow. But below the clouds, visibility is about 40 miles. Collins announces to passengers he's hopeful he can descend low enough to give them a good view of Ross Island. He spots a hole in the cloud cover and is cleared by air traffic control for a visual descent. But the four-man crew is having trouble spotting landmarks through the clouds as Peter Mulgrew walks up to the cockpit.
Peter Mulgrew was asked, why aren't you commentating? To which his reply was, well, it's pretty hard to say much when you can't see anything.
Still sure of his safe position over McMurdo Sound, Captain Collins continues his descent. Then, at 1,500 feet, the captain's confidence is shattered. Collins tells his crew that conditions, quote, don't look good at all, and that he'll have to climb out of it. Ominously, a minute later, all transmission from Flight 901 stops.
Then I started calling the field parties that were still on a listening watch to see if they'd heard anything of the aircraft. It was negative. No one had heard anything.
It's late afternoon when the missing jet makes international headlines. It's just before 1 p.m. on November the 28th, 1979. Air New Zealand Flight 901 is about to give passengers like Frank Christmas, seen here on board the powerful DC-10, an up-close view of one of the most remote and forbidding places on Earth, Antarctica.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the aircraft now is just over 10,000 feet.
And I think Dad was excited to think that there was a commentator on board that would tell them all about McMurdo and Scott Base and everything else.
But today, the weather isn't cooperating. Majestic 12,000-foot Mount Erebus is shrouded in clouds. Pilot Jim Collins asks air traffic control whether it's possible to begin his descent.
They got instruction from McMurdo at Jim's request to circle lower and be able to show their passengers something of the area.
237 passengers are straining to get a glimpse of landmarks like McMurdo Station that they should be seeing any minute. When suddenly, the ground proximity warning system blares out in the cockpit. The flight engineer starts to read off their altitude. 500 feet. 400 feet. Captain Collins realizes something is terribly wrong and calls for maximum thrust. The jet's nose tilts up 10 degrees and they start to climb. But as they pull up, the DC-10's underbelly and wing engines gouge into the icy slope of Mount Erebus, an active volcano at 300 miles an hour. 70 tons of jet fuel ignite the cabin. The tail engine breaks off and roars up the slope along with a horrifying trail of burning wreckage. Deputy Police Officer Ted Robinson radios the crew. He's met with an eerie silence.
We kept calling 901. McMurdo was also calling Flight 901. No one had heard anything.
There's still hope for finding survivors at 7 p.m. when Air New Zealand Flight Ops calls Maria Collins and asks if she's alone.
And he said, I don't want to alarm you, but Jim's flight is late. We haven't heard from him for a while. I suggest you get somebody to be with you.
The weather is so bad, it's 12 hours before rescuers finally spot the crash site. From the air, it looks like a smudge in the snow.
When we came around the side of the mountain and saw the total devastation, I was shocked. It just did not look like a plane.
Due to the speed and force of the crash, coroners determine all 257 people on board died instantly. Mountaineer Keith Woodford has his own ideas about how New Zealand's deadliest aviation disaster could have been avoided.
If they'd had acted 10 seconds earlier, there's a reasonable chance the plane would have been able to climb out of it. So close.
But why was the plane flying so close to the volcano? Investigators discover that on the morning of November 28th, Air New Zealand Flight Ops changed 901's final flight coordinate. Instead of flying their usual route down the middle of McMurdo Sound, the jet's route was shifted 26 miles to the east over Lewis Sound and directly into Mount Erebus.
Clearly, the pilots couldn't see the mountain or they'd have flown around it.
In June 1980, the Office of Air Accidents releases its findings, known as the Chippendale Report. It cites pilot error for flying at low level in an area of poor visibility when the crew was uncertain of their position. But in April 1981, a parliamentary investigation known as the Mann Report absolves pilots from any blame. Instead, Justice Peter Mann faults incompetent airline procedures, which change flight coordinates without warning. In a subsequent appeal by Air New Zealand, the New Zealand Court of Appeals faults Mann for overstepping his authority, but does not overturn his findings. The people of New Zealand have never gotten a clear answer to questions about exactly who is to blame for Flight 901.
Everybody's got opinions, but a lot of the evidence just has never been considered.
But one thing both reports agree on, weather was a key factor.
The record shows that they had thought they could get into clear air below the cloud at about 2,000 feet.
A weather condition called sector whiteout made the flanks of Mount Erebus seem to disappear. The optical illusion caused the approach to Lewis Sound, flown by Flight 901, to look identical to the approach they believed they were flying over McMurdo Sound.
They were seeing what they expected to see, a cloud base above them, a bay or whatever in the front, mountains to either side of them, exactly what they expected to see.
These whiteout conditions are very, very, very real. To be able to tell what's ice and what's overcast skies, the color's the same. You cannot really differentiate it.
Ted Robinson has never been able to make peace with the fact that the crew didn't heed his advice to detour over the mainland where the weather was clear, and that he never had his say in front of Office of Air Accidents investigators.
I maintain that I should have been called to that inquiry.
Maria Collins says she has never asked for sympathy.
I miss him. Still.
But feels her husband's reputation has been unfairly tarnished.
Why would he ever, in that situation, jeopardize anybody's life, let alone your own?
For passenger Frank Christmas's daughter, the emotional scars run deep.
I hated the word Mount Erebus. I just did not even want to know about it. But when I got there and saw it, it's the most beautiful place on earth. I am consoled 100% that Dad's final resting place is in such a beautiful place.
It's December 20th, 1995. In a little over 3 hours, the twin-engine Boeing 757 is scheduled to land in Cali, Colombia, just in time for the holidays.
It was my birthday, my 21st birthday, so the trip to go back home to Columbia was a gift for my birthday and to celebrate Christmas and New Year's.
Mercedes Ramirez's family was on standby for the flight during a 2-hour delay because of a snowstorm in the Northeast. They end up getting the last 3 seats. Miami-based crew captain Nicholas Tafuri spots lights far below, dotting Colombia's northern coast. This is his 14th flight to Cali. Tonight, his first officer is Don Williams. Just after 9 o'clock, they begin their descent and plunge into darkness in a narrow corridor between the towering Cordillera Central Mountains.
When you fly over terrain that doesn't afford a lot of lighting, backlighting, it's like flying into a black abyss.
Adding to the danger, 3 years before, anti-government guerrillas destroyed Cali's radar station, and it wasn't replaced. So air traffic control can't tell when planes are off course. That means 965's pilots will be relying on radio navigation beacons to guide them safely to the narrow mountain corridor to runway 1.
Flying in areas where there is no radar, where there is limited air traffic control services, puts additional workload on the pilots.
The weather in Cali is calm and clear, so air traffic control offers a straight-in approach to runway 19. The crew accepts the runway change, even though First Officer Williams says they'll have to scramble to make it in time.
A runway change is not an unusual circumstance. The thing that you have to recognize is if it shortens the distance that you have to fly to get to the end of the runway, can you get down in time?
The jet is descending more than 1,400 feet a minute as pilots fall further and further behind their landing checklist. Suddenly, Flight 965's ground proximity warning system sounds in the cockpit. They're just a few hundred feet from a mountaintop and coming down fast. The 757's huge Rolls-Royce engines accelerate as Captain Tafuri tells his first officer to pull up.
All of a sudden you're going like straight into the air like you're on a rocket or something, so it was just sheer panic.
December 20th, 1995. American Airlines Flight 965 is about to begin its descent to Cali, Colombia. The Boeing 757's approach is through a narrow corridor in one of the world's tallest mountain ranges, the Andes. 155 passengers are on board, including Mercedes Ramirez and both of her parents. They're eager to be reunited with relatives waiting for them at the airport.
And you could just tell everybody was excited because this was a Christmas back home flight.
Air traffic control clears Flight 965 to descend to 15,000 feet and proceed to Cali. Tafuri instructs flight attendants to prepare for landing. Then, air traffic control offers and Captain Tafuri accepts a runway change that will speed up their arrival time. But First Officer Don Williams says he'll have to scramble to get down in time for the shorter approach.
Modern jets are so aerodynamically efficient. One of the greatest challenges in flying them is getting them down and getting them to slow down. Speed brakes or flight spoilers are devices used to help increase the descent rate to help it slow down.
Captain Tafuri deploys 965 speed brakes and types in the navigation computer the letter R for Rosso, the code for the radio beacon a few miles short of the runway. But instead of flying towards the beacon, the jet makes an almost imperceptible turn to the left away from Cali. Seconds later, First Officer Williams says 3 words that cause tension in the cockpit to soar. Where are we? The flight management computer has inexplicably sent the plane in the wrong direction.
The instrument basically said, well, what you put in this box says that you need to make a turn and go back that direction. Well, that created a situational position confusion for the flight crew.
First Officer Williams has taken manual control, while the crew desperately tries to figure out where they are in the dark and what's going on with their computer.
The longer the crew talks about it, the more uncertainty there is that things are what they believe.
Out of nowhere, the ground proximity warning system blares out. The plane is at 9,000 feet, but the crew is unaware there's a towering mountain directly ahead. The first officer goes to full power and tilts the nose up so much, a stall warning erupts in the cockpit. There's mayhem in the cabin.
I just remember hearing people crying and screaming, and I was terrified.
Mercedes' mother and father help prepare her for the worst.
Through all of that chaos, I remember hearing my mom's voice. Her voice calmed me down because she was actually praying. I was holding onto my dad's hand at the same time.
12 seconds after the warning alarm goes off, the sound of splintering trees shatters the silence on a mountainside at 8,900 feet. Trees impale the jet's hull as 17,000 pounds of fuel explode on impact.
It was just the loudest, scariest sound I'd ever heard.
The destroyed jet's wreckage spills over the top of a ridge. Tragically, if a jet had gained just 200 more feet in altitude, they would have cleared the mountain. Unconscious and seriously wounded, Mercedes Ramirez is trapped overnight in the wreckage. She finally comes to early the next morning.
I was just asking God, please give me a second chance. I mean, I just want to get off this mountain. Just please send people to save us.
Her prayers are answered when she hears a helicopter.
I remember that two of the other survivors were jumping up and down and waving their arms.
Mercedes is too badly injured to get up, but uses a shiny scrap of metal to alert rescuers to their location.
I told them, I said, well, I can't leave without my parents.
Mercedes doesn't know it yet, but her mother and father are among the dead. That include 149 other passengers and all 8 crew members. Mercedes, one of only 4 survivors, is in critical condition with internal injuries and a broken pelvis.
My GI tract, intestinal area, had to be operated on and rerouted to get better.
Black boxes recovered intact prove the Boeing 757 was functioning perfectly. Now investigators have to find out what caused the jet to crash 4 minutes before it was supposed to land. According to Columbia's Civil Aviation Authority, it all comes down to a simple keystroke. Flight 965's crew misprogrammed the crucial final coordinate into the flight management computer. They typed the letter R for the Roseau navigational radio beacon near Colley's Airport. But the system interpreted the R keystroke as Bogota Airport's Romeo beacon, 132 miles to the east and behind the plane. The mistake reroutes Flight 965 directly into a 9,000-foot mountain called El Diluvio.
Had they typed in ROZO, that waypoint would have come up, but they didn't know that, and that was one of the lessons learned coming out of this accident.
Columbia's Civil Aviation Authority releases its final report in September 1996 and finds probable cause was primarily pilot error. The flight crew didn't adequately plan and execute their approach and lacked situational awareness. And they didn't revert to basic radio navigation when computer navigation became confusing in a critical phase of the flight. Colombian investigators also cite the crew's failure to retract the speed brakes, which prevented Flight 965 from gaining enough altitude during its escape maneuver.
Out of this accident came a design change that if you called for maximum power for CFIT escape type maneuver, that if the speed brakes were deployed, that they would automatically retract.
American Airlines agrees pilot error led to the crash, but is disappointed investigators did not also fault flight management computers and the lack of a radar approach. The NTSB releases its own recommendations a month later. That the FAA develop a mandatory controlled flight into terrain training program using realistic simulators to better train pilots to fly into mountainous areas. And that the FAA examine the effectiveness of enhanced ground proximity warning equipment to provide pilots with an earlier warning than the 12 seconds they had on Flight 965.
The Kali accident was one of the true industry game changers. After this accident, the recognition of the critical need for predictive technology revolutionized aviation safety, and the control flight into terrain accident type went down dramatically.
Out of all the planes that were in the sky that day, why our plane? Why us?
Mercedes Ramirez still struggles to make sense of a world without the two cherished people she lost that night.
I would do anything to turn back time and just be able to hug them and tell them how much I love them.
Mercedes was driven to share the lessons she learned from her brush with death, and today she travels the world as a motivational speaker.
It's about realizing that every day you have a brand new second chance at life, at work, at your career, and with your family.
January 20th, 1992, 6:20 p.m. Air Interflight 5148 roars down runway 36 and takes off from Lyon, France on a short commuter flight to Strasbourg. 90 passengers are on board, most of them business travelers, and 6 crew members. Graduate student Nicholas Skurias is in the last row of seats.
I was visiting my girlfriend who was living in Strasbourg.
Captain Christian Hecquet and First Officer Joel Sharabin are in the cockpit of the revolutionary Airbus A320, the world's first commercial airliner to have completely computerized controls. Its bold advertisements declare a superior intelligence has arrived.
It's similar to what you have on your home computer when you're trying to fly a flight simulator with the joystick. It's all computer controlled. You're never physically moving the flight control.
Air Inter was a regional sort of airline, so this was a bit of an upstart carrier, but they were a highly motivated group that wanted the airline to succeed.
Part of that success depends on competing with France's high-speed train system, putting pressure on the crew for an on-time arrival.
You got to get it on the ground, in the gate, offloaded, loaded, turned, back in the air, and you're racing the clock.
Flight 5148 is routine until air traffic control tells the crew they'll have to land on a different runway. Because of a change in wind direction, the active runway is now runway 5.
When there are last-minute changes, such as runway changes or route changes, pilots don't like that because they've already programmed the computer to fly a particular route to get to the airport.
Complicating things even more, air traffic control recommends a non-precision approach, a type of manual landing the pilot has had very little experience flying in this brand new computerized jet.
Non-precision approaches do not have the electronic vertical guidance. And in this case, that was part of the issue. The descents require a lot of pre-planning, using a procedure that they don't use a lot.
Air traffic control doesn't know it, but the pilot wants to stick with his initial flight plan and make a precision approach to the original runway. Then, once flight computers have gotten the Airbus into position, he'll go manual and circle to land at the new runway, runway 5. Flight 5148 begins its descent. They plan to land in 15 minutes. But there is growing tension and a growing problem in the cockpit. Captain Hickey is getting behind his breakthrough jet.
Getting behind the airplane is a widely used statement to say that the pilot's thinking of what's going on is behind where the airplane actually is.
At 7:13, Captain Hickey finds out he'll have to switch to manual even earlier. Otherwise, he'll have to wait for 3 other jets scheduled to take off from the same runway.
If you're going to fly that kind of approach and you've never done it before, that in and of itself can become a distraction.
With zero visibility in the fog, pilots are having trouble keeping track of the Airbus's horizontal position. The plane ends up almost a mile left of where they should be on approach to runway 5. At 7:19, landing gear is down and locked. But the Airbus is descending way too fast at 3,300 feet a minute. Passengers are completely unaware of the serious problems in the cockpit.
I didn't notice something strange. It was a quiet, normal flight.
Just as passengers are asked to make sure their seatbelts are fastened, a low-altitude sensor rings out in the cockpit. 200. A second later, a monstrous crash into a mountaintop. The world's most intelligent airplane is on descent from Lyon to Strasbourg, France.
It was one of the most technologically advanced airplanes in the world, particularly in its early days.
It's a raw, foggy night, January 22nd, 1992. A wind shift causes a runway change that complicates Flight 5148's approach.
It's a high demand requirement to change a runway for pilots when they're in close to the airport.
Captain Christian Hickey turns on the plane's wing de-icers and makes a left turn onto final approach. But he's having trouble. There's zero visibility, and they're almost a mile out of position to the left of the runway. They're descending way too fast at 3,300 feet a minute. Then, out of nowhere, a low-altitude warning. 200. 1 second later, the Airbus slams into Mount Saint-Odile.
The noise of the disintegration of the airplane was so huge that I didn't hear anything else.
The nose section disintegrates when 1,200 gallons of jet fuel ignite. The plane's undercarriage tears off as it plows through the woods.
You are going right, left, hurting your head in the front of the seat.
The last 7 rows, including Nicholas Scurious' seat, shear off from what's left of the plane.
I realized that the airplane was completely disintegrated. I was completely terrified.
Scurious escapes out into the snow, but he hears another survivor trapped in the wreckage, a panicked mother trying to save her baby girl.
The mother was not able to move, so I have to take the baby.
The mother and daughter and 7 other passengers survive more than 4 hours on the snowy mountain waiting for rescuers to arrive. The horrific crash claims 87 lives, including both pilots and 3 crew members. In November 1993, France's Ministry of Transport and Tourism releases its official report. Investigators cite a chain of causes. First, the crew was late in modifying their approach strategy and did not properly configure the plane for landing.
The sequence of events in this particular accident was in a very compressed time scale. They can't process or assimilate the information fast enough to identify it, understand it, correct it, and execute.
But the fundamental cause cited by investigators is the pilot's failure to correct the abnormally high rate of descent of 3,300 feet per minute. Investigators say the error occurred because of confusion about a crucial knob that controls both vertical speed and flight path angle.
They mistakenly believed that they were setting up a 3.3 degree descent profile. But with the mode selection they had made, they set up a 3,300 foot per minute rate of descent, which the airplane struggled to make.
The ergonomic design was poor. It should have either been a button that identified what mode you were in, or it should have been two separate panels.
Other causes cited in the investigation: below average crew interaction and poor communication, and the absence of a ground proximity warning system which deprived the crew of one final warning opportunity.
Given that this was a short-haul, fast operation, they were going to get a lot of nuisance warnings, and they didn't want that presented to the flight crews all the time.
Air Inter defended its lack of a ground proximity warning system, saying it would not have prevented the crash. By the end of the year, Europe's joint aviation authorities require all air transport aircraft to be equipped with a ground proximity warning system. Airbus modified the A320's flight control unit so that a vertical speed setting would be displayed as a 4-digit number, preventing confusion with the unit's flight path angle mode. Air Inter also increased pilot training for the A320.
After the Monsanto deal, you can't compose a crew with 2 persons with less than 300 hours of flight on Airbus A320.
Je suis désolé. I am heartbroken.
The sadness endures for Hubert Degollier, who lost his son Hugh Degollier, a flight attendant, in the crash. He still can't accept the moment that took down Flight 5148, the turn of a knob that began their lethal loss of altitude.
Ils ont eu 17 secondes.
They had 17 seconds to realize that they were in a bad descent. They weren't aware. Why? Because they put their trust in the automation.
In the aviation community, weighing the benefits and risks posed by automation is an ongoing debate.
Manual handling skills are critical, and the appropriate use of automation, balanced in keeping manual flying skills, is one of the current and future industry challenges that we have, and we're struggling with it.
Painful memories of the Mount St. Odile crash are now etched in stone. But Nicholas Skouras will always give thanks for being one of the few survivors that snowy night.
You quickly realize that you are not invincible and you are human. So, life goes on.